So I just wanted to share a few of, I guess, my takeaways from the day, and obviously invite anyone who wants to. We have a microphone over there, so I'd welcome you to do that. The things that stood out for you. For me, it's been a really fantastic day of sharing. I guess that's the crucial thing. And so one of the things that's really stood out is this idea of sharing and collaboration, that I think it is challenging for any institution or any group in any single institution to have all of the answers and to be able to do everything that we want to do. But it's also encouraging that we're actually seeing a lot of common practices across institutions. Just to come back to this morning's session that Mary Ellen was talking about, some of the pieces that really stood out for me that she shared, and we've talked about it all day, but certainly the idea of the harm reduction focus. We're definitely hearing that the idea of abstinence only doesn't actually work. The idea that we can keep people safe simply by saying don't consume. So it's more the educated approach to that. And the other piece that stood out for me was about the social norm messaging. Certainly this idea of the perceived daily usage versus the actual usage. I know we've seen that, more recently in conversations, particularly around cannabis, the perception that actually much, much higher numbers of students were actually using cannabis than was in reality. Some of that also for us is about the perception of the university and the approach that we would take to, and certainly before October, about anyone who was using cannabis, that wouldn't be a conversation we could have, even for those involved in supporting people with substance use disorders. I know that we've certainly felt that actually students wouldn't necessarily come and tell us about such a thing, with the idea that that would be punishable rather than something where we would help support. So that definitely stood out for me today. It seems like a ridiculous thing to say, but the idea that we would actually get feedback from students, that actually we would be listening. I think we've heard a couple of times today about the idea of university administrations, and being someone who is in the administration, it's crucial that we do listen. Students are often the experts. I know we said students and experts, but I think we often find that students are the experts. That is a time in life that has changed for me. I certainly remember certain parts of it. I haven't forgotten too much of it, although I do remember my 19th birthday, and anyone offline, I'll tell you about that after this, but I'm not going to make a confession now. But it stands out in my experience. So actually the experts on campus, we absolutely have the likes of Dr. Colleen Dell and Dr. Peter Butt and others that we've heard, but actually students are often the experts, so actually listening to them and having that conversation. Other things that I really enjoyed for today from Colleen was around creating long-term social and behavioral change. I think actually it is how do we make this stuff stick rather than as a one-off. I like the view that actually we should focus on attitudes, not just behaviors. I think that's a crucial piece, because actually I think we've heard that today from Kate about the work she's trying to do in a leadership role, is to actually influence the perspectives around, well, actually, how many students are here to drink? And it was very clear to me in exactly what Kate was describing, that not everyone wants to go to those events, but you feel you must. So there is some kind of a potential loss there, but actually there is fear. And I become aware of certain events because through the grapevine of my teams, they're saying, yeah, we're hearing a lot of students is kind of murmuring on the grapevine that there's concern. They feel they have to go, but actually there's consequences. There's judgment potentially in what happens on that evening. One of the really important things also, I think, is how we frame that then. Certainly the idea of the gain-framed messaging is hugely important, where we're not talking about deficit and loss. And I thought Lethbridge actually did a pretty good job of that. It's really tricky. It's really nuanced not to be wagging our fingers at people saying, thou shalt not do this. But actually the idea that behavior and attitudes can change. So I think there's positive aspects, and I was recently involved in some work with the Canadian Centre for Substance Use and Addictions, and the thing we spent much of the day talking about was actually how do we do this in a gain-framed kind of a way. But certainly that idea also of working with young people before they step foot on campus. And Dr. Butt and I were talking about that at lunchtime to say actually, even from a young age, when we have such a prevalent issue, and I know we do in this particular province around the culture, our culture of celebration, but also our culture of the mourning of loss. And well, everybody's cracking open a beer or some kind of a drink, and so how do we get at that a little bit? Because these are the cultures that children are growing up in. And so I think a lot of it is actually the high school students before they step foot on campus. And I think I'm hearing that quite clearly, that we actually need to coordinate with that work. But also we know that we have such a resource in our high school counselors, such an amazing group that come to our campus sometimes. But it almost feels so late in the day that actually the students are 17, 18 years old by the time they're coming into contact with some of those messages. So what more could we do collaboratively that isn't necessarily on campus, but it's probably in the high schools, or even earlier than students getting to high schools? I think one of the big things that stood out as well is in terms of things being theory and evidence-based. And I think that's absolutely the thing that stood out at the University of Saskatchewan. We've had real success, that it becomes compelling. And not only to the expert crowd, but actually we're pulling on things that we absolutely know to be true, rather than saying, well, let's just try this might work. So I think that's a hugely important thing. And I particularly like Dr. Butt's comments around how we think about long-term risk, so liver disease, cancer, versus shorter-term risk, so of injury or harm, and what we mean. And his point, what do we mean when we're talking about risk? And it's very difficult, I think, for any of us to really think about the long-term risks of the things that we do, but particularly when you're young, when you actually feel indestructible and think, well, it's not going to cause too much harm. But I think that's where we need to find a way into that space that isn't about, wagging our fingers. But certainly the short-term risk, I thought Lethbridge did a really good job of, which is to say, well, actually, I think the appointment with the prof, by the way, probably should have been an exam, but it is just to say that there is consequence. But there are other ways of doing it. But that was one that stood out for me, which is great. And we talked a little bit about, with that particular panel, about some of the changes of habits. I think much of what we think we know about the habits of students, we're wrong about. I know we certainly talked about the idea of, I think there will be a historical perception of the population in universities being, half a century ago, largely male. And so I think we still have, in many ways, some of those views which aren't true, but also the idea that now the percentages of female students drinking is actually, in some cases, outstripping the male students drinking. And do we know why? Do we understand some of that? But do we also understand some of the culture of why students are choosing not to drink? Because I think millennials can sometimes get a bad rap, but there's a lot of stuff they've figured out. They're super practical in lots of ways. They're watching YouTube videos, they problem solve, and I'm very optimistic, about this generation. And I was talking to a young man not that long ago in a cafe, and I was telling him what my job was, and he was telling me that he'd taken some time out of school for his mental health. And I didn't think anything of it at the time, and then I walked away and thought, wow, I can't imagine anybody doing that a generation ago, saying that they were struggling, they needed to step away. And I think the same, I'm optimistic about the same things when it comes to things like substance use. So those connections between mental health and substance use and sexual violence, the way those conversations are swirling around and that sort of Venn diagram effect that we're seeing, I'm really optimistic, but I think and from what I'm hearing today, we need to do a better job still of really being able to strip away some of the stigma and be having those conversations when people are younger, even before they come into this environment. I'm really excited by all of the initiatives we've heard about this afternoon. Interesting that wristbands came up twice in different ways. So certainly Kate talking about really a stigma reduction piece or a permission piece about wearing a certain wristband. Again, we were talking at lunchtime to say, I think it's a student initiative. It's not a university initiative to say, please put on this wristband. But also, I really like the idea from Owen about the wristband being used for information purposes as well, so that people have the information available to them. I've certainly heard of certain events where people have ended up without a phone or been actively encouraged not to take a phone on a particular event, and people ending up in parts of the town that were unfamiliar to them and really struggling to get home. So different ways that we can actually make information available. That's an exciting prospect. All of the What's Your Cap stuff we've talked about a little bit, but I like the positive messaging about thinking about my drinking and actually students sharing their own experiences with one another, or what a change might look like. And I think particularly what we've heard from Eric, particularly from the University of Calgary, I know actually just as I was walking around, two people said, yeah, that's a great idea in terms of actually the the post-alcohol support space. I know we've seen examples of that, but certainly the practicalities of how, and I guess that's where you were getting some questions about, like how would we do that, how would we fund that? But I think a partnership piece I could see between a university, a student union maybe, but also student residences. So I think there's definitely some interesting opportunities there. And the red frogs. Well, what a simple idea, I guess, that we actually have this collective responsibility, but actually a community of care. And not to try and wrap things up too neatly, but actually just this idea of where I started off in the morning talking about that we care for ourselves. So there's a sense that actually each individual on campus is their own primary caregiver, as it were. But actually then we extend that to other people, that we have this community of care, that we're caring for one another. And I think we can sometimes lose that in these party situations where actually the focus is on having a good time, but then recognizing at a certain point in time, are people having a good time anymore? Or is it just a much more difficult, complicated conversation? So that to me stood out as a really great idea of, and if there's a global organization piece there, what else could we be doing? I know actually one of the things that it ties in with is some work that's done around sexual violence prevention, and it's great to see that's part of that around consent fairies at events, going around and actually keeping an eye on people and checking in. So I think that's hugely important, and I think it's the right generation to do it right now in terms of people actually caring for one another. And I really appreciated, it's a slightly different slant, but I really appreciated Brent's comments about training student leaders to actually understand liability. Certainly that social host responsibility, because it's not trying to wag fingers, but it's often saying to student leaders, I think we can often assume they have way more knowledge than they do, and that we're preaching at them. But actually, I think training is absolutely needed to understand what responsibilities, but also what can happen. So I think that's an enormously important part of the duty of care, but also the responsibility of student unions. And so I guess I'm hopeful hearing those kind of conversations, but of course the reality is when you offer weekly drop-in sessions to come and learn, people don't come. But I think actually I think if we keep at it, and I think the answer being if we keep at it collectively, so are there some online learning pieces that people could do? Does it always have to be in person? I know certainly our view of recording things for today was to know that people couldn't necessarily be here in person and people can consume content in their own way, but to actually have that kind of information and learning accessible. And for me, a lot of the learning that I'm hearing that we've been talking about today is not about anything that happens in the classroom. In fact, so much of the learning opportunities are the everyday engagement on campus, but students engaging with one another. So I think we can sometimes lose sight of that when we're talking about teaching and learning strategies, because our focus tends to be on the classroom. And I would say that for me, for many of students on campus, so much of the very best learning they do is, if they choose to access services, sitting down with a counselor in our wellness center, for example, and some of the learning that they can do and some of the choices that they can make in that space. So it's all the other professionals. So I think we really need to broaden the scope when we're talking about teaching and learning, that actually the teachers are every single one of us and all those interactions. I don't know if anybody else has any comments or reflections they'd like to make on the day. No pressure. Yeah, please. Do you want to?
Just as you were talking, one of the things that was interesting to me is I don't know why I was thinking this way, but like a trifecta of what can encourage harm reduction. So you've got, students becoming engaged and peer helpers. You've got research and evidence-informed practice, and then you've got student service people sort of tying those together and helping the initiatives to go forward. And I was actually just feeling really hopeful about changing culture around substance harms.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. Yeah, and I guess one of the questions we posed at the beginning of the day for the wrap-up today was, where do we go from here? And I feel like, what we've heard from here, and I know we're going to write this up in a report of some description, certainly to share with our colleagues from the CCSA, is I think we felt going into this that we didn't want to feel that we were repeating ourselves every year, that there wasn't progress in that way. And I think we've come a long way, by the way, so I'm not suggesting that's the case. But I think perhaps coming out of that, I can commit, certainly from our perspective at the U of S, to actually see, well, you know, are we onto something? Is there a particular framework? We know PEP-AH's framework absolutely is the one that we work within, and we didn't spend a lot of time. I know Eric talked about it briefly today, but actually, do we need to retrain our sights on some of what's there to actually say, well, absolutely, I think it's keeping it simple with some of those things that we're already doing, but how also do we enable other people at, and in some cases smaller institutions, even regional colleges, to actually be doing some of this work? And so how do we develop those kind of partnerships? And so I think within provinces is one thing, but actually doing things cross-provincially to actually have either some resources or even just to bring some of those people together. And I know that the CCSA does this quite effectively. But yeah, how do we actually do that together, particularly across the 11 member institutions of PEP-AH in Western Canada? I think there's definitely scope to do that. And I know we have representation from a number of them here. So absolutely, I think, you know, those three pieces we've heard time and time again. Yeah. Any other comments that people want to make or takeaways that they'll take from the day? All right. Well, in that case, it just remains for me to thank everybody who has joined us in Saskatoon, everyone that we've heard from today, all of the great ideas shared and people taking the time to be here, but also for those who've traveled from BC, from Alberta, but also in a sense, I guess, Owen, in a way, from Manitoba as well. So thank you very much, and we will look forward to seeing people in 12 months' time, wherever that proves to be, and we'll keep the conversation going. Thank you very much.